Now let's explore a few of the essential functionalities related to domain controllers and specifically user management. I think that's really interesting to see how it's being done on a administrator side of view so that we can better understand what the options are and how we can create and secure domain accounts. So first of all, on a domain controller, which is what we are connected to here, we have to open up the server manager. This is an essential application that provides a pretty good overview of all the features and services that are running on this domain controller. Now, first up, a Windows server system does not provide Active Directory domain services out of the box. We already have a domain server enabled, but typically what you need to do is go to add a role, and then within this add roles and features wizard, you can then select Active Directory domain services. And once you install that, that means the services and the features are running so that you can actually use this Windows Server system and promote it to a domain controller. Only then you have all the features that you need to run a basic domain environment. We've already done so you can see here, there's some roles and some server groups. The local server and services notifications here are not really of any concern at this point, but we can see Active Directory domain services is up and running. We also have the file and storage services enabled, which means we can share files and create file shares for our domain environment. Now, first things first, you can see also Active Directory domain services up here. This means this is where you would see all the domain controllers within your domain environment. Obviously, you only have this one system here. There's nothing else connected to it. You see the server name, its IP address, and the number of events and services that are running. And a few of those services are really essential for Active Directory. For example, Active Directory provides Kerberos authentication, so you can see the Kerberos services running, and a number of other services that are also very important. And another thing you can see, there's files and storage services. This is where you would essentially add any file shares for users to read or even write to. We do not have any of those created, but there is something really important that a domain controller comes with out of the box. You can see there's a hidden net logon file share, and there's a sysvol file share. And the sysvol file share actually even contains the netlogon scripts folder. So this means anytime a system logs on a domain environment, it authenticates it against the domain controller, and it also would execute any scripts located in this file path in order to configure or customize the endpoint to its needs. So this is where scripts automatically get executed from when a computer logs on to the domain environment. And this is very important to keep in mind, especially considering that if a threat actor would ever be able to get a hold of the write permissions to these file shares, they could essentially have the entire environment or all the endpoints execute scripts, PowerShell scripts, batch scripts, anything along those lines. And there's the general sysvol folder. Highly important, especially also because it doesn't contain netlogon scripts. It also includes group policies, for example, and you can also share files through sysvol. This file share is readable for endpoints typically. So anything you share along here is something that automatically gets downloaded by endpoints and applied, such as policies or scripts. Now, this is where you could potentially also now create your own file shares. Again, we do not need to do that. This is just a general overview of some of the most important, but also out of the box components that a domain controller comes with as soon as you set it up with default settings. In order to add features or roles and additional services, we have the tools menu, and within the tools menu you can see for all of the different kind of areas there's an application for it. Now when it comes to Active Directory users and computers, there's a menu for this. Once we open it up, you can see there's the Active Directory users and computers application, and within that you can see this is our domain, and the domain is called bcs.local. This could be anything that you named it to, but bcs.local is our domain, and here we have all the different groups and objects that are contained within our domain environment. So you can see here, built in, out of the box, there's a number of security groups. So these are the groups that automatically come out of the box when you set up a domain environment. There's also a folder for computers. So if we had any other computers authenticated, logged on, or joined to this domain, they would show up here. So typically in a production environment, you would have a whole number of computers in here that you can manage from this interface. Here is a group for domain controllers. So if we had several domain controllers, obviously they would show up here. And then one more, the most important part for us here is there's users. And within users, you can see again, there's security groups, but also there's users. And out of the box, we have an administrator user, and this is who we are logged onto this domain controller with. So we are the administrator, and there's also a guest account, and that symbol means that it's disabled. So really, there's only one account that exists within the domain environment, but also just built into this computer. Now, this account is highly important because if you right-click on it and go to properties, you can then see member of. And this basically determines the permissions of this particular account based on the groups that it is part of. Now, it is part of the administrator group, so this means it has administrator rights on this computer. It also is part of domain admins, which means it also has administrative rights across the entire domain. And this is really important to keep in mind. There's also domain users, so it's also part of a standard user group, but this technically has less privileges than the domain admin group, so the domain admin group would typically override that. On top of that, it's also part of the enterprise admins group, so we could also manage entire forests potentially with this account. We can create group policies, and we are schema admins to actually modify the schema of the Active Directory. So this account can do anything. It's usually not a great idea to log on as use the account a lot or log on to domain controllers. It's best practice to create separate accounts for different tasks. But this is the out-of-the-box account, and that's a really powerful one. Okay, so this is just a quick overview of what the features are that you can, on a high level, use on a domain controller. Now we want to create some users and see how we can apply permissions and privileges, and what are some of the most common kind of best practices of how this is being done. Within this view, let's say we want to create a standard domain user and a domain admin user. So you right-click and click on New and User. And here we can then add a first name, a last name, and basically the logon name. So let's say we want to create a username Alice and Wonderland. And then our logon name might be Alice, would make sense in this case, at the bcs.local domain. So this is our user logon name, and that's unique within the environment. Next, we need to define a password. So I'm just going to type password with a 4 instead of an A, with a 0 instead of a O, and an exclamation mark at the end. That's just to make sure that it actually fulfills the complexity requirements. We can also say if the user has to change passwords or not, but next logon, if they even can change passwords, if they expire. Again, nothing of concern at this point, but just some options here. And then say finish. So now we have a standard domain user created. Let's create a domain admin. Now, in this case, we'd also go and just create a user. Let's call it Bob. Bob Ross, it's a good name. And then logon name just Bob. And then same thing for Bob, we just create password. And I guess we can uncheck all those boxes. In this case, doesn't matter. So now we have a user Alice and a standard user Bob Ross. If you remember from previous discussions and also from the administrator account, in order to make this account a domain admin, we have to click properties and add it to a group. So let's add, and then just say admins, which is basically the group we want to add it to. Now, if you click check names, it would underline domain admins because it recognized our command. So we say OK, and then apply, and voila. So this account now is part of domain users and also domain admins. So this account means with domain admin rights, you can do a lot. You can log on to any system across the environment. You'd be automatically local admin, and you would also be able to log on to domain controllers, which standard domain users cannot do. So this is how you'd create and apply permissions based on groups for users within your domain environment. That's just an interesting and important concept to understand, because if certain credentials are compromised by threat actors, you need to know if those are just users or even administrator accounts or even service accounts, and what the privileges are, what the permissions are, what an attacker might be able to do with that. That definitely also determines the risk profile. Now, there's a couple other ways how a threat actor might do that. They typically do not have graphical access, interactive access to this domain controller. So what they would do is oftentimes they have command terminal access, so CMD, to any system. And in order to create new users, obviously you need to be either domain admin or an enterprise admin. So for us right now, we are administrator, so we should be good to go to create any accounts. This would not be possible for 𝗙cie on a random system. Bob Ross should be able to create accounts as well. So let's do that. Let's practice how an attacker would, for example, create a user account and promote it as to a domain admin even. In that case, we can use the net utility. So this is a really handy utility to quickly enumerate and learn a little bit more about the computer, the users, the groups that exist on the system, and also on the domain. So you can do net accounts. Here you can see basic requirements for user accounts here: password, minimum length, and expiration dates, and things along those lines. Now you can also do net groups. And here you can see already domain groups. So domain admins, domain users, domain guests, domain computers. So anything that is part of the group, we can query by saying net group and then just type the group name. Domain admins. So now this is a command that we can use to query who is a domain admin, who is part of the domain admins group in this domain environment. There's the administrator and there's Bob. Now we can also query for Bob. In that case, we have the users. There's user command, so net user. And we can see the users that are known to this system are 𝗙cie, Bob, administrator. There's the 𝗙cie_𝗹𝗹cie service account, which is an important account in the later sections when we talk about 𝗙cie. Now let's just say net user and then query for Bob. And this is already interesting because you can see Bob, full name, when it was created, password sadly expired, and also all the group memberships. So this is a handy way to query for all the group memberships for a user account. Now let's say we're an attacker and we want to, for example, create our own account so that we actually know the password of the account and we can use this account as a backup mechanism. For example, if the response team would be able to uncover our activity and terminate our sessions or even deactivate our current sessions or user accounts, have a backup user account is always a handy way. So let's just create a new one using command line terminal. In this case, we would say net user. And then now you can also create a new one by adding a few flags. Let's say John Smith is the user account, and then we have to set a password. And then just do add, and we want to add it to the domain. So /add/domain. Completed successfully. So we just created the user, which now should be a standard domain user. Now we want to add this user to the domain admins. In this case, you can do net and now use the group command. And then from there, we just do domain admins, and then John Smith. Then again, add main. Okay, so this should have added John Smith to the domain admins group, and that automatically means as an attacker, we could now use this account and perform domain admin activities, tasks across the domain environment. So let's see over here, Active Directory users and groups. We need to refresh. There is a John Smith, and John Smith is now part of domain admins. Yep, so that just worked. Let's say we as the response team detected the account. We quickly want to disable the account if we have the permissions to do so. There's also a quick command to use the net utility. So you can just do net user John Smith, then say active no domain. So active no should disable the account. Let's double check. There you can see John Smith has this little down arrow attached to it symbol. So the icon now tells us that this is a disabled account. We can technically unlock it again. Let's say it's disabled. One additional thing that we want to have a better understanding of is also the accounts, the groups, and the permissions that are associated with it. So right now we see that we are logged on as the administrator. We can type who am I, confirm we are the administrator, and then there's privileges associated with the session. So if you type /priv, command is priv, and then hit enter, there's a whole lot of privileges that are associated with the account, most of them disabled, but still this is a lot of privileges. So this means we are the local admin and have any privileges to perform any tasks on this system. So what would that look like for other types of accounts? So let's say Alice that we created as the standard user earlier. Alice is only a domain user. Now this is a domain controller. So if we want to log on as Alice to domain controller, that should technically not work. Only domain admins should be able to log on to domain controller. We can prove that by running a process as Alice and just see what happens, because under the hood, there's still just an authentication that's going to happen. So we can use a command called run as user, and then say Alice at bcs.local. And let's say we want to open up a command terminal for Alice. So run as, and then /user, and then the Alice at bcs.local. We want to open up a cmd.exe. We need to type in the password. And as soon as you do that, you should see login failure. The user has not been granted the requested logon type at this computer, which means at night we were not able to authenticate against this computer to run anything. Now there's also a domain admin, net user Bob. You can see here, Bob is part of domain admins. Now if we do the same thing as before, say run as, but now we want to run as Bob. Let's say a new command terminal works just fine. And then type in the password. This is now authenticating, starting a new process, and the new process now shows us this is the new terminal. And who am I? We're running as Bob. And if we do priv, you can see with some privileges to it, we are a domain admin. So that means we do have a whole lot of permissions that we can carry out on the system, but that goes to show that we are successfully able to authenticate against this domain controller and run process or log on to this system after all. Now, this was just a quick overview to show how you can handle and manage user accounts on a domain controller or in a domain environment and the permissions and groups associated with it. Hopefully that helped in a high level to get a better understanding of what is really important to look for when you are dealing with potentially compromised user accounts, to understand what an attacker might be able to do in the environment and also how to respond accordingly.